Today's focus is on the Wild Horse Fire Brigade, which is an all-volunteer California 501c3 corporation, and its purpose is to reduce catastrophic wildfire and save the American wild horse through better land management. The gentleman you're going to hear from is a naturalist and an ethologist. So he has been living among and studying wild horses on more than 20,000 acres of beautiful land, and he's done this for the last 8 years. So his experience, his opinions, his insights into how to better manage these beautiful wild herds as they help us to reduce the incidence of catastrophic wildfires in our environment. So please welcome to the stage the founder and the executive director of Wild Horse Fire Brigade. This is William Simpson.
Thank you very much, JJ. And good morning, everybody. Thanks for attending. Sorry we're a little bit late with this, but here we go. So I'm William E. Simpson. I've been living among and studying wild horses in the wilderness. These are free-roaming wild horses that were originally documented actually by Sir Francis Drake in 1580. So we have evidence of that. And so they're a very interesting herd of horses made up of about 20 family bands. It gives, because they're free roaming in a wilderness area and unmeddled with, we have natural ecology happening. We have predators present that manage and regulate the population, which is really important. Wild horses, when they're managed in the absence of their co-evolved predators, creates problems. You have population regulation problem. You have a lack of natural selection, and this leads to other problems genetically. I think this whole native versus not native subject has been put to bed fairly recently. In fact, over the last 5 years, there's been a tremendous amount of information come out, DNA, paleontological information, cultural archaeological information, including a recent dissertation by Dr. Running Horse, Yvette Running Horse Collin, where she's looked into a lot of the archived information about how horses got reintroduced to America, but also the splinter populations of wild horses that survived the Ice Age. We know that to be a fact now. I think pretty much anybody who's really well read and educated on the American wild horse knows they are native species. So that one's been put to bed. The problem we see today on the landscape is consumerism represents a very large market segment it drives the American economy. It drives politics, and it drives the management of public lands. Everybody, and these are just a sample of a few corporations, I'm going to have a couple more here, but when we look at all the things consumers are buying, the raw materials it takes to produce these products, which are in high demand and growing through the internet now, the distribution of, Amazon is delivering products faster than ever before, and companies like them. People want products. They're not going to give up what they want. We've got 97% of Americans that eat meat. We've tried, in 71, I became a vegetarian thinking, oh yeah, we can change the world. 200 gallons of water, 20 pounds of grain, make 1 pound of beef. We can feed a lot more people if we don't eat as much meat. When I thought of that idea with a lot of other people in 71, when I was at Oregon State, 2% of Americans were vegetarians. Today, 3%. It's 50 years later, so we've moved the needle one click. It's just not working for us. And we can't get people to let go of what they want. When we look at everything that we're buying, people in this room are holding devices that are using lithium batteries. Where does lithium come from? Well, it comes from the ground. In fact, a lot of the lithium's coming from Nevada, where we're currently seeing large roundups. So, we have to look at, there's going to be this demand. We can't make that demand go away because consumers are not going to give up what they want. And when you start looking at the companies involved and the kind of revenue that these companies are bringing down, these companies are dictating to politicians through campaign contributions. They basically have a lot of influence. When you write a politician a check for $100,000 for his campaign, he's going to listen to what you got to say. In fact, you probably have the phone number right in his suit for his cell phone. So if you're a big corporation and you've written a check for $100,000 to some politician, you can call him up and say, hey, I want this to happen. And he's probably going to listen to you. Whereas the average American voter who's not funding these campaign contributions, they're polite and they listen, but the reality is they're not doing what they need to be doing because they're driven by consumerism and the power of money. You know, when we start looking at these companies, why hasn't the SAFE Act passed in the last 20 years? It's nothing new. It's been out there for a long, long time. Why? Because Nestle owns Purina. Purina has the second largest dog food and pet food company in Mexico, just over the border, and they need a constant supply of horse meat. We have 7.5 million domestic horses in America today. And at any given time, there's thousands of domestic horses that need help. And a lot of those end up over the border in slaughter. And mingled in with those horses are, of course, some of the Mustangs from the failed AIP program. People, the BLM would like you to believe that adoption and prisoner programs and stuff is really moving the needle on saving rounded up horses, but it's not. When you look at how many horses that end up in the programs, it's a small percentage, right around 5–7%. And then of those horses that end up in programs, very few actually become trainable. Most resist training. They are wild animals. They're not domestic. So, you know, you can imagine trying to get a wolf out of the wilderness and then make him into your pet dog. You're going to get bit. A lot of these horses, and I have personal experience with a lot of horses that we've had to rescue, good trainers, people highly experienced, get kicked, they get bit, they go, okay, that's it. Horse ends up in the auction, and it's unfortunate. And we're seeing a lot of BLM freeze-branded horses at the auction. That's a fact. So how do we change this? You know, when you've got this much power, we're looking at corporations that run America that want access to public lands. They want minerals, they want petroleum, they want livestock. They're all involved. You know, a lot of people don't realize the petroleum industry produces over 3,000 consumer products. We can't fight this. What we can do is we can find out, is there a middle ground where everybody can win? Is there a middle ground by modifying our management methodology? Right now, consumerism is what is pretty much killing wild horses. So people tell me all the time, oh, it's this person, it's the BLM, it's the ranchers, it's these guys, it's those guys. Really, all you have to do is go and look in the mirror, and then you're seeing who's helping kill wild horses. Because we're buying the products. We're spending our money on the products where corporations are going, good, we like this money, we're going to go get the raw materials off the public land, and we're going to provide these consumers with products. We're all part of it. There's no pointing the fingers unless you point it at yourself too, because we're all sitting here and we all have got plastic products, we've got batteries, we've got things that come off public lands. So when we look at wild horses, and again, as JJ's mentioned earlier, I live among and study free-roaming wild horses in a wilderness. They're not in corrals. They're not PTSD horses that got rounded up and then put on a confined acreage as a sanctuary. These are free-roaming American wild horses. And we have evidence that they've been on the landscape where I am on the Oregon-California border since 1580. For people that are not historians, to give you an idea, in 1580, that was 90 years after Columbus first discovered America, and it wasn't until 168 years later that the Spaniards finally made it up from Cabo San Lucas and set up their first mission in San Diego with some of their horses. Okay, these horses are a long ways to the north. So this is a splinter population. In fact, I talked to Gus Cothran about this population. He thinks we should start beginning some genetic studies because he believes there's a likelihood they are, in fact, splinter populations survived the Ice Age. I believe there's other horses like that too. The Pryors have a lot of old genes. There's other horses that are understudied, Canadian herds. So these guys, and we've seen this because our herd actually stopped, it helped CAL FIRE stop a catastrophic fire, the Klamathon Fire in 2018. These guys naturally graze and they reduce the fuel. And that creates areas of low fuel where when you do have a fire, and I've fought fire, I was on the Klamathon Fire line 9 days as a local advisor. And before that, I worked in the forestry business logging, so I fought the small fires back in the late 60s and 70s. So fire needs fuel. When we look at what's going on in California and Oregon and other western states, we're chasing the evolution of fire. We have a tremendous amount of science that says when you have a collapsed herbivory, the critters that eat grass and brush, catastrophic fire evolves. You know, you look at Dr. William J. Ripple from Oregon State, Professor Emeritus, Forestry. He did a study, the collapse of large body herbivores, and there's, I don't know, maybe 24 universities part of that. They looked at the paradigm of collapsing herbivores and wildfire around the whole world. And what they found is that in every case, when your herbivory collapses, you end up with catastrophic fire. Every case. Australia is a really good example. California is a great example. California is down right now. They haven't done a deer census in a long time. The last one showed we were down almost 2 million deer. And Oregon is currently down 500,000 deer. That's important because those deer in those two states were grazing about 3 million tons of annual grass and brush. Okay, so we're throwing money at this like crazy. Taxpayers were doubling and tripling the suppression costs. We're spending money to fight fire, but as we see, and this is the latest I could find, it even got worse in 2022 and 2021. So you look at the Tubbs fire and so forth. Fire, we're chasing it. We're chasing it and we're not catching it. It's like a VW bug chasing a Porsche. We're getting farther and farther behind every year. Wildfire is a big problem. People don't understand fire. The chemistry of combustion requires 3 ingredients. You have to have your oxygen, you have to have an ignition source, and we have to have fuel. In this case, we're talking about grass and brush, okay? Climate change, a lot of people think, oh, climate change, that's causing the fires. No, it isn't. What it does do is it dries the fuel sooner and it keeps it all dry longer, which creates a perfect storm, the opportunity for the first source of ignition. Can we control sources of ignition? No, we have lightning, we can't control human behavior. But we can control the fuel. We can't control how much oxygen is in the air. Wind does not, you'll see this a lot in the newspapers, wind-fueled fire. There's no such thing as a wind-fueled fire. Okay, wind does not fuel a fire. Fuel fuels a fire. Wind blows it, it drives it in a certain direction, and it moves the heat front over new fuels and causes those fuels to combust. It's important to understand fire because that if we're going to beat it, we have to know how it works. And there's so much misinformation about wildfire, it just blows my mind. This is from InsaWeb, which is a U.S. Forest government website. They cover every fire, thousands of fires. This is an example of a recent fire up by us, the McKinney fire. It ended up being over 60,000 acres. And when we look at the fuels involved, this is their forensic report. We see grass 2.5 feet tall, brush 2 feet tall. Those were key fuels in that fire. This is an area that is depleted of herbivores, and it burned catastrophically. And after this big fire, because the land was reduced to dirt, I mean, it just took it down to the dirt, it pasteurized the soil, killed the microbiome, killed all the seed banks in the soil. And then a rainstorm came just a couple weeks after this fire was starting to end and brought in over 100 million tons of debris flow into the Klamath River, and it killed salmon and trout for 75 miles down the river. It was a disaster. So these fires are not only damaging the landscape, they say anywhere between 20 and 80 animals die per acre in one of these fires. You know, you got your amphibians and your reptiles and your small mammals and your birds that are overcome. Even some large mammals are massacred in a million-acre fire, and we have gigafires in California. You might lose 20 to 80 million animals. How long can we do this? I mean, this is not sustainable. When we look at the collapse of the herbivory, It's steep in California and Oregon. It's just dropping off like crazy. And it's well documented. California, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, our deer, both the blacktail and the mule deer in Oregon are down. They're managing mule deer in Oregon, 125,000 animals below the targeted management level. 125,000 animals are not there that they want to be there on the landscape, just in Oregon. So this is a really nice image from Canna Foundation, and it shows the importance of the wild horse on the landscape in a balanced ecological system. When you look at the current methodology that the BLM uses to manage wild horses, they're commingling cattle and livestock in areas. The boxes were drawn in 1971. The science for the 71 Act comes from the 50s and 60s. So that's really old science. I mean, by today's standard, that's prehistoric. So we know so much. I mean, back then, that's when Jane Goodall discovered that apes made and used tools, and the world, you know, rained on her parade because they were saying that's not true. That's the science we had in those days. Okay, we've come a long way now. We've come a long way. We know that when we commingle livestock and cattle together, because the livestock people are very good at removing predators. They've been taking them off these areas for over 100 years because you can't make money if the apex predators are eating your lambs and your calves. So for over 100 years, with great prejudice, apex predators have been removed. These areas are ecologically collapsed. When you cut out your apex predator, in the trophic cascades, everything underneath collapses, and this is on these lands, these herd areas and herd management areas. This collapse happened a long time ago. It's not even recent. It happened 100 years ago because they've been using these lands for a long time, probably a couple hundred years. So we have to understand that when you manage horses in the absence of their co-evolved predators in North America, what happens? Their population's not regulated. And on top of that, you don't have natural selection, which maintains the genetic vigor of the species. The predators are uniquely able to sense sick, weak, elderly animals, and they go after those animals with a priority. That maintains the vigor, the genetic vigor. You know, I was talking to a guy who has a champion racehorse, and he was talking about how, the older racehorses could smoke any of the new thoroughbreds today. And I said, well, that's probably too, because you're inbreeding so much, you're losing things. Guess what? Where I live, I says, we don't have slow horses because they die real quick. The predators get them, so we're breeding for fast horses up there. These guys, wild horses, have unique abilities to survive in the wild. You take a domestic horse and put it where I am, it's not going to last very long. It's going to be meat for the predators. We have bears, lions, wolves, coyotes, even the big bobcats will take a small foal. So we need to understand the benefits. Everybody says, oh, wild horses are a scourge on the landscape. They're terrible. They're this, they're that. Those are all myths. Those are all monetary-driven narratives. They're false. The BLM is guilty of publishing a false narrative. Right in their summary for managing wild burros and horses on page 1, paragraph 5, it says, wild horses have no natural predators. That's untrue. That's a false statement by a government agency. So we know for a fact that every apex predator in North America is the co-evolved predator of the wild horse. That's a fact. And anybody who's a rancher out there on the landscape knows the truth. We see it all the time. I've documented over 100 depredations by various apex predators where I am. Okay, so we know it's false. Now, what are their attributes? What do they do for the landscape to help balance it? Well, these are just a couple examples of what we see up there. They're natural. They do symbiotic grazing. So they take the grass down, they keep it down year-round, they manage it, but they also reseed. Okay, invasive species, cattle, sheep, those kind of critters, they've got a multi-chambered stomach, they chew a cud, they're ruminids. They're very good digesters, and we have studies, the germinability of horse dung and other studies from Oregon State that talk about what comes out the back end of a cow as far as seeds. If they eat native flora, the seeds from grasses and plants, how many survive? And they've also done the studies on what happens with horses. Horses are monogastric digesters. They have a very simple stomach. 90% of the seeds generally that come out the back end of a horse and drop onto the ground and their droppings, those seeds grow. This middle slide shows a picture of a stud pile that's been rained on. It's 1 season old, and you can see all the different grasses and plants that are coming up out of that horse dung. We know that they reseed naturally, and that's very important for your ecosystem because there are a lot of critters that depend upon the native flora. Okay, you've got birds, you've got other small mammals, you've got pollinators. If you bring in an invasive species and it grazes off an area and they digest the seeds, you end the life cycle of those plants and grasses. That affects other critters. It affects the birds, the small mammals, the pollinators. Everybody loses their food source except for the grazing animals. So we have to be careful about where we do our livestock production and where we have our horses. Okay, so what we're talking about with Wild Horse Fire Brigade, and the BLM kind of just hides some of this information because it's not optimal for them to talk about it right now. But there's a couple of paths we can use. One doesn't exist, but the first one does exist, which is HR 1625, humane transfer of excess animals. Any state, county, city, town, any government authority can request horses under the Humane Transfer Act 1625, and they get them. And BLM actually has a whole page on their website about how they have to provide the horses when they get a request from a government authority. They have to give them to them. So once a state or a county or a city gets some horses, then they can do just what we're doing right now with livestock in many counties, which we're doing fire grazing with livestock on U.S. forest land. Now, the livestock guys will do that primarily on the edges of the wilderness. They don't want to get too far out there because they suffer depredation from all the apex predators. So in the deeper wilderness, and we have 115 million acres of what is called designated critical wilderness, 115 million acres that are prohibited from any motorized vehicle or equipment. Okay, I used to raise cattle. I was in the FFA. I did pulled Herefords and Suffolk sheep, okay? And I can tell you right now, if you can't use motorized vehicles where you're managing your cattle, you're not going to be able to compete in the marketplace. Your logistics costs will be way too high. So they like to be close to decent roads. Now, we've got all this critical wilderness, 115 million acres, that are burning down. A lot of that acreage has critical trees. You're talking about sequoias and things like that, watersheds that are critical, fisheries that are critical. And by putting the horses through a great cooperative grazing permit, just like we're doing right now with livestock in some of these areas, they get the horses under 1625, put them up there, graze them, and reduce the fuel. It's a home run because now you don't have horses going into slaughter, you don't have overburdened sanctuaries, and then the horses get to be wild again, which is what that's what they're all about. Their freedom is everything to them. A lot of people don't understand that. They see these wild horses and they say, oh, you know, I can break that horse or I can do this or again. Very few of these horses are suited to being domestic horses. They don't want to be your pet. They're wildlife. You might as well, I mean, if you're going to go down that path, you might as well start grabbing eagles out of the sky. We'll make them perch birds or this or that. It's a ridiculous concept to take a wild animal and then treat it like it's domestic. These fires that we're seeing on the west coast of the United States right now are devastating. I mean, in 2018, Courthouse News reported $180 billion loss in California alone. A part of that was insured, so the insurance companies took a hit on those. We look at some of these smaller fires, you know, like the Camp Fire, you look at the Tubbs Fire, you know, you got single fires that are over $10 billion in losses. This is not sustainable. I mean, you know, we don't have the money to keep doing this, and on top of that, we're losing forest faster than it's being generated. At some point, we're going to run out, and then what do we do? Firefighting isn't cheap. If we start rewilding these horses, for instance, if we start moving these horses out of these off-range holding where we're paying a lot of money, taxpayers, we're feeding them grass in a confined holding corral that doesn't have grass. You look at the Haythorn Ranch, for instance, that CBS News covered recently in Denver. You you look at the Haythorne Ranch, well, they were going into bankruptcy because they let their invasive species cattle and sheep eat their ground to the dirt. So they couldn't make money anymore because they weren't grass farmers. Where I come from, all the ranchers, we're all grass farmers. We all know how to rotate crops and do it right. On the East Coast, these guys had so much, or I should say central United States, they had so much land, I got 250,000 acres, I don't need to go out there and seed. And they just ran their cattle. Well, they ran out of, the invasive species did what they do. They stripped off the native flora, and now they got dirt. So what did they do? They went to the BLM and said, hey, we got fenced land, and we want to do off-range holding. BLM gave them a contract. They gave them 900 horses, paying them $1 million a year. So now what are they doing with those poor horses? They're in basically a confined area. It's not wild. It's not where they belong. And they're buying the cheapest hay they can find and then pocketing the difference because they got no grass. When we look at Wild Horse Fire Brigade and rewilding these horses, we see the benefits really quickly. And like I said, we saw this whole concept, which is not just me saying this. We have a tremendous amount of published science by dozens and dozens of PhDs who say when you reduce the fuel, you reduce your wildfire, you devolve your wildfire. We can do this. These horses, when Cal Fire came up on the Klamathon Fire, as 38,000 acres killed people, when it rolled in on the edge of where I live in the wilderness because of our small herd of horses, that fire started losing its strength because it didn't have fuel. Cal Fire was able to get into the areas where these horses grazed, and they were able to situate men and equipment in front of the fire and then fight that fire toe-to-toe, and they saved the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument. That was a big deal, and everybody saw it. There was no argument about it. They saw the benefit of having wild horses in the wilderness doing what they naturally do. So Wild Horse Fire Brigade, what we're about is we're not trying to take jobs from people. What we're trying to do is say, look, there's a better way to manage our wild horses. There's a far better way to do this. And all we have to do is just move horses where they provide benefits to consumers and taxpayers and keep the grazing areas that are already basically ecologically collapsed. I mean, if you look at some of these areas, and leave those alone for livestock, everybody wins because the horses get, if we use 20 million acres of that 115 million acres of designated wilderness, we could rewild 100,000 horses at a distribution rate of 1 horse per 200 acres. 1 horse per 200 acres, and then we'd only use 20 million of that. So we got more than enough land where you can't do livestock production, where we can relocate these horses where they're natural predators that control them. This is what's important. We can do this, and this is what Wild Horse Fire Brigade is about, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you.